Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome on a cold Melbourne night to the PMI Victorian History Library. For those of you who haven't met before, my name's Judith, and I'm the Library President and Chair of the Board. And a warm welcome tonight to our speaker, Patrick Ferry from the National Archives, and Alison over there, also from National Archives, who's going to talk to us about some stories from the ASIO files, so our Australian Security Intelligence Organisation. And I'd also like to acknowledge a couple of board members in the room. Michael, do you want to just stick your hand up there? And Dennis down there in the middle. Welcome. Our library is located on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Just a note about our facilities if you need them or if you haven't already found them. Bathrooms are either through this door or the door that you came in. It's on the other side of this wall. So if you go around that way, you go on your left. If you go around there, they're on your right. And in case of emergency, two emergency exits. Again, one out here to the end of the corridor, the other one back where you came in through the main doors. And if there is any sort of emergency, we'll make sure our staff escort you safely from the building. I'll just let you know that this year it's quite a momentous year for us. We're celebrating our 170th anniversary. We're established in 1854 and we're the second oldest library in Victoria. We've got a collection of over 40,000 items and take great pride in being the sole library in Australia with such an extensive collection that's actually available for loan that you can borrow and take home. And our focus remains rooted in local history. We have a wealth of information on pretty well every town across Victoria. I will tell you about the book display tonight. We always have a book display in our little cabinets that relate to the talk, and there's a couple, one there, one at the back, another one in that corner. But Ellen, who is at the very back, who signed you in, Ellen, who is our collections librarian and volunteer coordinator, and her mum, Penny, who is here. Ellen's granddad and Penny's dad was the head of ASIO in the 1970s, and the family's brought along some of the family artefacts for you to see. So as well as many of the wonderful books from our collection about ASIO and spy and security history that we've got here for you in the cabinets, we've also got a small display in that cabinet down near the kitchen relating to Sir Albert Edward Woodward, who was the Director General of ASIO between 1976 and 1981. So you'll see two of the shields he was presented from other security agencies. There's an original cartoon of him and Malcolm Fraser that was done by Peter Nicholson, and there are several letters from other security agencies given to him upon his retirement, as well as a note from the National Dairy Liberation Front from when they liberated the family's milk. I'd like to explain that to you at some point. But if you want to know more about liberation of the family's milk and other things, certainly speak to Ellen or Penny. And thank you very much for bringing those items along tonight for people to look at. So we're taking photographs and videos tonight, which we use for our promotional purposes. So Jade's on the camera there. Take pictures from time to time. If you don't want to be included, do let us know and we can accommodate that easily. And we'll also have time for questions at the end for Patrick. So I'd like to introduce Patrick Ferry, who is the Assistant State Manager of the Victorian Office of the National Archives of Australia. I've known Patrick for many years across various roles. I think the previous one was Information Manager at the Bureau of Meteorology. But he could probably predict what next week's weather's going to be like, I would say.
Or at least I know the people we can.
Yes. So Patrick's an archivist, information manager with over 20 years experience in the field. He's also the author of various local history books and the winner of a Victorian Community History Award in 2020. And he's going to tell us some secret squirrel stories. Over to you. Please take him on.
Thanks, Judith, for that warm welcome back to the PMI. It's great to be here tonight. It's a institution that's very venerable and has a very purposeful role in promotion of local history. So it's very gratifying to be here. I believe I'm also in the collection here too. I've got a couple of books in the collection. So as Judith said, I'm going to talk to you tonight about some of the stories from ASIO's files. And I think when we think of espionage, probably a couple of images come to our mind. One is James Bond, very suave. You know, I was watching a James Bond movie fairly recently and I'm thinking, gee, you know, I'm not nowhere near the actor's age. I couldn't do any of that. The other, we perhaps, if we're of a vintage, think of is Maxwell Smart. I can relate a lot more to Maxwell Smart than James Bond, I must say. Anyway, one of the interesting things about the stories I'm going to tell you tonight, we're going to look at the story of a doctor, a teacher, a gardener, and a real spy. But one of the things I just want to emphasise right at the beginning is we're not dealing here with fictional characters, we're actually dealing with real life people, people that could have been your neighbours, people that could have been your colleagues, that sort of thing. All right. So we'll just start with a little bit about the National Archives. How many of you have used the National Archives at some point? Wow, this is great. Lots of hands going up there. So we're the archive of the Commonwealth or the federal government, and we operate under the Archives Act of 1983. And that empowers us to preserve the most significant records of the Australian government, records that get designated as retained as National Archives. Three very smooth initials, RNA, that Judith probably gets haunted by at night, with all the records authorities you must have worked on over the years. We're a unique federal cultural institution in that we have a presence in every state and territory capital. So unlike the War Memorial or the National Library, where you've got to go up to Canberra, we do have an office here in Melbourne. It's located in North Melbourne at the Victorian Archive Centre. So we're located with the Public Record Office. And amongst our network of offices, we have more than 360 kilometres of records in formats ranging from, you know, 19th century bound volumes and parchments and things right through to digital data that's obviously coming in from agencies and everything in between. I believe it's about 45 million individual items in our collection, which is bigger, interestingly enough, than the archives of the United Kingdom. But we haven't had things like the Great Fire of London, the Blitz, Civil War, various other things that have, you know, destroyed parts of their records. How many of you realise that the Archives Act actually gives every single one of you statutory rights? I hope you feel empowered by knowing you have statutory rights under the Archives Act. Your statutory right under the Archives Act is you can request access to any Commonwealth record, so long as it's over 20 years old. So it's got to be over 20 years old under our legislation. If you're wanting something under 20 years old, which act are you going to exercise? Freedom of information, correct. And we have to give you access, subject to some exemptions under our Act. A little bit about ASIO. So the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, ASIO, was founded in 1949. There was actually an intelligence surveillance function of the Commonwealth going back to the First World War, actually. And it had various manifestations. It started off with military intelligence in the context of the First World War. The Commonwealth Police Force had an intelligence arm in between the war. We've got a lovely series of records here in Victoria, which come from the Commonwealth Investigation Branch in that interwar period. And there was a Inspector Roland Brown, who was the man in Melbourne that if intelligence needed a report on a migrant or something, you'd always see Roland S. Brown would do the legwork. During the Second World War, an organisation called the Commonwealth Investigation Service was formed. And then after the war, ASIO was established. And the picture there is of Sir Charles Spry, who was the first Director General of ASIO. And he went right through for for quite a few decades, actually. So the stories we're going to share tonight come from the ASIO files. What do I mean by that? So there's a series of records in our collection. All collections have a structure, as you know. Archives tend to be structured around the organisations that create the records and then the series of records that they accumulated to document particular functions. And in this case, we're talking about a series called A6119, which has the very, shall we say, oblique title of personal files. But these are the files that ASIO created in the context of monitoring people of interest, shall we say. And these contain material collected not just by ASIO, but also some of its predecessors as well. Now, these records are actually not in the custody of the National Archives. They are still held by ASIO, but we have processes whereby we can make reference inquiries on behalf of people. So we'll show you how to do that later on. Request goes to ASIO, do you have anything on this person? They come back yes or no. If it's a yes, there's an access examination process because as you'd appreciate, there are many aspects of intelligence work that can still be sensitive many, many decades later, but we'll talk about that in a little while. So let's get into the stories, and I hope you enjoy the stories. Most of them have a Victorian flavour, so I feel it's something that might appeal here. But we'll start with the doctor. So I'd like to introduce the doctor to you. So his name was Arthur Deering, and he was a Hungarian-born, Italian-trained medical practitioner. And in actual fact, he lived and worked in Italy for many years until Mussolini in the late 1930s began implementing anti-Semitic laws. So Arthur then became a refugee. And interestingly, because he was Jewish, now interestingly, he first went to Cuba. Not a place that you'd instantly think of as a safe haven. But interestingly enough, Cuba was one of the few places in the world in the late 1930s that did not actually slam the doors to Jewish refugees. Australia didn't quite slam the door, but they didn't leave it very far ajar either. There was very strict quotas and things like that. But Arthur managed to get to Cuba, but then he came to Australia in February 1940. And it was not long after he came to Australia that he started to attract the interest of military intelligence, and he remained a person of interest to ASIO for the next 40 years. Now, he was married to Perla, who's on the left-hand side of the slide there. Now, she was born in a place called Bessarabia. Now, if I had a prize, does anyone know where Bessarabia now is, what it's now called?
Georgia?
No. Not sort of in the right vicinity. It's Moldova today. So between Romania and what is now the Ukraine. So Perla was a trained chemist, and after arriving in Australia, she and Arthur actually moved out to a place called Tura in South Gippsland. Because Arthur managed to get a position in a practice, in a medical practice out there. The resident doctor enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force, and so Arthur was able to get a position there. The photograph on the right, which comes from his family, and I'd like to acknowledge Ingrid Svensson, his granddaughter, is of the family out at Tura. Now, Arthur first comes to attention not long after he arrived in Australia because he sent a letter in Russian to a friend back in Bessarabia, which had just been occupied by the Soviet Union. And as I said, Perla was from Bessarabia. So the letter was intercepted by the military censors and then it was translated. But in the letter, Dr. Deary wrote, quote, "I imagine how glad you are that eventually, after an expected long time, our dear guests have arrived," end quote. And military intelligence interpreted that as referring to the Soviet invasion, and it was said to be typical of the way of conveying news under a harmless disguise. And it's red flagged him as somebody already who may have communist sympathies. So a few months later, Arthur obviously was a bit of a writer. He liked to write to his friends overseas. So a few months later, he writes to somebody in Cuba. And as I said, he'd lived in Cuba. And in his letter, he mentions that he had a wireless set and he liked to listen to the broadcasts from Havana. So this is 1940, right? We're in the middle of a war. So, this is attracting a bit of attention. Now, as an alien, not from Mars, but of someone who was a migrant of non-British origin, he was subject to a number of restrictions. So he had travel restrictions already. But there were certain things he owned, just personal items like a camera, the wireless set, and a diathermy set, which apparently is a bit of medical equipment that uses radio waves, starts to attract a little bit of attention in Tura. Okay. Now, the other thing that attracts attention to Arthur in Tura is there's an Italian prisoner of war camp not too far away. And Arthur, of course, had lived in Italy for many years. He was very fluent in Italian. And he made contact with different Italians. In actual fact, if you go through his file, it talks about, he'd invite Italians to come and have dinner, after they'd gone to mass, in the church and things like that. But this starts again attracting attention in the town. It's like, he's talking to the Italians. And in actual fact, he ends up being accused by people in the town of engaging in political conversations with Italian prisoners of war. And it's actually, from the file, it actually is clear it's one of the local Catholic priests is the one making complaints about him. Now, the military actually take this quite seriously at the time. So they're instructed, for instance, that any Italian prisoners of war who need medical attention are not to be sent to Dr. Deary. For example, they go to another town just so that they don't have to be treated by him. Now, all these reports are starting to come through of Dr. Deary's activity. So in 1944, the Victorian Special Branch sends an officer down to Tura to make a comprehensive investigation. And the report, which is on the ASIO file, has a very interesting opening line. It's very illuminating, because the Special Branch detective opens by saying, quote, "I have to report that on making inquiries in Tura, I found Dr. Deary to be the centre of a hotbed of small-town gossip. It was said to be associated with the religious question." So you've got to remember, he's Jewish in a town where there'd be no other Jewish people. Professional etiquette, in quote unquote, so there's some professional rivalries going on, coupled, quote, with a certain amount of suspicion which in these times is directed against all foreigners. So he's a foreigner in town. He's got to be suspect. There's got to be something going on here. Now, the file has some interesting examples of the local attitudes. So you can see here the first one where the police inspectors interviewed a lady who did say she did tell me she believed Dr. Deary to be a spy because she'd heard that First Constable Hopkins of Tura Police had taken a transmitting device from him. So there's all this sort of rumour and innuendo going around. However, a local solicitor found him to be one of those who adopt the attitude that although no one knew anything to the detriment of Dr. Deary, one should treat all foreigners with suspicion. And this was typical of the views in town. So he's ultimately cleared by the Special Branch investigator, who says that if he had been subversive, there'd be something he would have demonstrated by now. So he actually gets a clearance to be naturalised as a British subject at that stage. There was no such thing as Australian citizenship in 1944-45. So he got that clearance. His file then goes a little bit quiet for a few years, and then up it pops again in the late 1940s. By this stage, Dr. Deary is up in Healesville so up in the ranges there, northwest of Melbourne. And again, he's in the centre there of a lot of local gossip, rumour and innuendo. He's accused by some locals of being part of a communist cell trying to stir up the timber workers. And some of the reports on the file are quite interesting. There's a report, for example, by one local that at some point when they were in his house, they just happened to be rummaging through his piano stool, as you do, and they found apparently the sheet music for the Russian national anthem in the piano stool. Apparently communist books on his bedside table. So I don't know, Dr. Deary must have ducked out to the bathroom or something while the guests were in the house and they'd gone through his house, I don't know. He was good friends with a local solicitor, Ian Lasry. Now you'd be very familiar with Ian's son, Lex Lasry, a very passionate civil libertarian, later Justice of the Supreme Court. But Ian Lasry himself was regarded as being somewhat suspect. A medical colleague of Dr. Deary's at the local hospital reported that Deary was, quote, red, not pink. So Dr. Deary in 1961 actually makes headlines in Melbourne because he becomes at the centre of a controversy because he gets dismissed from the local bush nursing hospital. And this had to seemingly do with a number of factors, including conflict, personal conflict between staff in the hospital. But there were protest marches in Healesville by mothers that were in favour of his reinstatement. One of the slogans, I think, was something like, 100 babies can't be wrong. Because he basically, helped all these local mothers give birth. So there were protest marches, but this gave rise to more rumours, including fears that the communists were trying to infiltrate this local protest movement. Now, you've got to remember, in all fairness in all of this as well, this is set against the backdrop of the Cold War.
Yeah.
The intense ideological and political rivalry between the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc. But, here we have a small town doctor getting caught up in the middle of all of this. It's very nice when I can show you a secret document. It has been declassified, in case anyone's wondering. So ASIO started to look into this, again, a bit more deeply. And at this point, they could only conclude that he was a communist sympathiser. So interestingly enough, they didn't turn up enough to actually conclude, for example, that he was a member of the party. On his file, there's some interesting things. They even had, which magazines and newspapers he subscribed to, all sorts of things. And he did periodically keep bobbing up on their radar screen right through to the early 1980s. Interestingly, in the 70s, he developed an interest in China. So this was another red flag. And a particular medical tour he did of China attracted interest. Now, it wasn't just Arthur himself. His by now former wife, Perla, was also a person of interest. There's an interesting dimension to that. They got divorced and it went all the way to the Privy Council in London. Not many Victorian divorces, I suspect, end up in the Privy Council in London. But also, when he remarried, ASIO was very interested to learn more about the identity of his new wife, for example. One of his daughters as well, labelled number 1 in that surveillance photo on the left, was also of interest because she was involved in things like the Eureka Youth League and things like that. Now, this photo, taken from quite a bizarre angle, is people entering a nondescript building off a lane somewhere, and it happened to be a Communist Party or youth meeting or something like that. So it gives you a bit of a sense of what's on these sorts of files. Now, I'd like to now introduce the teacher. Now, what's quite interesting about, I think in some respects, the doctor and the teacher, these are professions that had quite a deal of respectability, a social cachet almost in that era, very middle class. wonder whether that also colours, the concept of, well, these are terribly subversive people. They might be able to influence people. I'll leave you with that thought for a few minutes. So Doris McRae is the next story, the teacher, and was from Pakenham, which in those days was a small town. Don't know if the dairy liberation movement ever reached Pakenham. There's certainly a lot of cows out there in southeast of Melbourne. Doris' father was a teamster. Anyone give me the definition of what a teamster was in the 1890s? Bullock carts. Yep, leading teams of bullocks and carting goods. Her mother, Mary Jane, was actually a teacher for many years, and she was apparently a very good teacher, but she had to resign from the teaching service when she married Doris's father. And it's interesting later on as we go through Doris's story, women's rights and the campaign for equal rights in the teaching profession becomes a very strong motif in Doris's social activism. Now, she's born in the 1890s. Some of her earliest memories were of people doing it really tough in the wake of the 1890s Great Depression. There was a greater one about 40 years later, but in the 1890s, people were doing it very tough. She was very, very bright. In 1907, she sat the entrance exam and was accepted for the Melbourne Continuation School, which was, I believe, the first government high school in Melbourne. And it was a secular school. So again, there's some things starting to emerge that will influence Doris's attitudes throughout her life. Apparently, the family sold a cow at one point to actually get a bit of wherefore-all so she could come up to Melbourne to take on her schooling. And they got £2 and 10 shillings for that cow. Now, after graduating from continuation school, she went back to teach in Pakenham. And then she taught right across Victoria. So she studied for a period at the Teachers College and at Melbourne University, then she Scotland. And she worked as an exchange teacher in a small agricultural town northwest of Aberdeen. But she also got to travel. So she went to the League of Nations, to visit the League of Nations in Switzerland. She was clearly seeing the effects of the Depression. She also went to Moscow and the Soviet Union at this time, which is quite interesting. What's interesting is that's not picked up on her file at this point. She doesn't attract the attention at this stage. But in the 30s, she goes to Moscow. Now, where military intelligence becomes interested in her is in 1939. She's invited to attend a militia recruiting rally at Brighton. So she's a teacher at Frankston, so she's come up the line to Brighton. And she created a stir by allegedly speaking out against compulsory military conscription or training at that event. And she was publicly accused in the press of being a communist, which she at that stage denied. But she's attracted the attention of the military intelligence. Now, in 1940, there are representations to the local Member of Parliament, James Fairbairn, that she had allegedly been teaching disloyal things in her history classes at school. So she allegedly had said, quote, England was the cause of the war, that England would not give Germany any colonies, wouldn't let them have the raw materials. Now, interestingly, we did this talk a few months ago at North Melbourne, and we had one of her former students come in. And the former student was now well into her 90s, and she said she never said anything like that. Anyway, she's interviewed by Roland S. Brown and others, as are students, and the students actually denied that anything was said, and one student went so far as to state that Miss McRae did not make any utterances that were disloyal. Now, it should be noted that at this stage, she's regarded as an extremely good teacher and she's extremely liked by her students as well. But some of the parents are obviously a bit, what is she teaching them? Now, she does, though, during this period, obviously she comes out in many ways very publicly interested, at least, in what's happening in the Soviet Union. She published a book called Education in the Soviet Union. She also began lecturing at Marx House for the Communist Party. So, but what we see through some of her writings is this very strong theme around education, preschool for children, the rights of women, the rights of women to work, that sort of thing. And it's interesting that that becomes quite a consistent theme throughout her life. On that whole concept of women's rights, she was an executive of the Victorian branch of the Union of Australian Women. And she was also involved in some of the very early organising committees for International Women's Day here in Melbourne. But these sorts of things attract attention as well from ASIO, because again, there's this fundamental underlying concern that she might be communist sympathiser, then all of a sudden she's involved in International Women's Day. Is there something deeper here going on? And there's quite a lot of keeping tabs on her. So she gives a talk somewhere, so that bottom piece of the slide there. Notice the name of the field officer has been redacted out. So the identity of ASIO operatives, unless they've been named in some other context publicly, are protected identities. But you can see she's given a talk, you know, she's received something from Bucharest. There's other things about where she's given a talk at a particular place, that sort of thing. So there's quite a lot of intelligence being gathered on her. Anything she writes in the newspapers is going onto the files, that sort of thing. Now, in 1952, she was a delegate for the Union of Australian Women that went to Vienna to attend a conference on the defence of children. Now, this conference was regarded, I think, officially as being a bit of a front for, you know, left-leaning organisations. But anyway, she goes to Vienna and she goes across, and then anyway, her baggage is searched. Copies of her passport and photograph are sent through to ASIO, all sorts of things. But what's quite interesting is that at one point on that European trip, she went back to Moscow. And on the flight back from Moscow to Berlin, she actually was seated on this plane. And she happened to be seated next to a gentleman who had the grand title of being the Queen's Messenger. So what the Queen's Messenger was basically a diplomatic courier. So someone that carried diplomatic material between British embassies. Anyway, this Queen's Messenger was actually basically having a fairly long conversation with Doris on this plane. And after he got back, he wrote up and typed up a lovely report that then basically gave his assessment of Doris, which then got sent to headquarters of ASIO. Now, what's quite interesting, she talked about many things like you would do. She talked about her travel plans. She was a little bit disappointed not being able to go to China. You know, all of these sorts of things. She talked about her views on the royal family. I don't know how that came up, but it did. So there's quite a conversation here with the Queen's Messenger that's all documented in a multi-page report. But what was quite interesting was his summation at the end. So he said, quote, "I would not consider her a dangerous element from the point of view of organising unrest. But he did go on to say that at the same time, the danger would seem to lie in the fact that she was able to impress people with the fact that she had been to Russia and could speak with apparent knowledge of conditions. And it's quite interesting, a few years before this, there was a royal commission into communism in Victoria. And in Parliament, in the state Parliament of Victoria, she was publicly accused of being a communist. She was publicly accused of teaching communistic ideas to her students at Flemington. She was publicly named in the appendix of the Royal Commission. She had no comeback to any of this. It's in Parliament and in a Royal Commission. She retires through ill health from the teaching service. That's the degree of impact it had on her personally. But it lies in this notion that she's in this sort of trusted position as a teacher. She's got young and vulnerable minds that she's seemingly, according to the rumours, undermining. Again, I mentioned, when she went to talk at places, so she went to talk at 6 Grandview Grove at Camberwell. She was the guest speaker. Someone in the crowd is recording everything, interestingly enough. Now, Doris's career, as I alluded to, comes to it was a very distinguished career. As I said, she's one of the most senior female teachers in Victoria. It ends in a bit of a cloud. She retires on health grounds, but obviously she's been named in this Royal Commission. She's been named under parliamentary privilege. The local Catholic priest in Flemington has organised a local campaign against her to try and run her out of the school. But she never gives up on her activism. She continues to be an activist for the rest of her life. Interestingly, after she retires, her ASIO file just drops right off. And Dr. Sheryl Crow, Cheryl Griffin, sorry, not Sheryl Crow, the singer, whom some of you will know, her theory is that it's once she ceases to be a teacher, she's not seen as a threat anymore. It's an interesting theory. And interestingly, though, she remained a fairly unreformed Stalinist, really, in many respects. She remained true to that. The Communist Party splits and all sorts of things, and there's denunciations by Khrushchev. But she seems to have been, back what she saw in the 30s, whatever they showed her in Russia, left that, might have been a Potemkin village, all a front, but whatever it was, it left that lasting impression on her for the rest of her life. The gardener. Let's turn to the gardener. Someone that you probably remember. Now, this is not a Victorian story, so we might claim Tasmania as part of our own just for the evening. So Peter Cundall, yes, has an ASIO file. So best known as the host of Gardening Australia on the ABC. Very interesting childhood background. He was one of 6 children born into a very poor Manchester family. Left school at the age of 12. Worked as a milk boy and a tram conductor before joining the British Army at the end of the Second World War. So he served in Europe at the end of the war, and he witnessed some of the horrific things. He was present at the liberation of one of the concentration camps, for example. Interestingly enough too, he was stationed very close to the Yugoslav border at one stage. And anyway, the way the story is told, he got lured across the border by a beautiful young lady. Ended up locked up in one of Tito's prisons for a little while and then eventually was released. So there's some interesting elements there. By 1950, he wanted to come to Australia. And not unusually, few ex-British soldiers did this. They enlisted directly into the Australian Army. So you could enlist directly into the Australian Army in the UK. Went on to serve in the Korean War, and he apparently became a very committed pacifist after his experiences in Korea. But interestingly, for his future career, the Australian Army, when they weren't in Korea, were based in Japan. And guess what he went and travelled around Japan looking at? Gardens. And he became very interested in Japanese garden design. Anyway, he first comes to ASIO's attention in 1959 through his contact with the Pioneer Bookshop in Sydney. Now, believe it or not, on these files, there were like subscriber lists, and you think, where on earth did they get them from? The same year, his name appeared on mailing lists for the Tribune newspaper. There you go. And in 1960, ASIO received a report that he joined the Communist Party branch in Launceston. At the same time, he was secretary of the Peace Forum in Launceston too. Now, he does actually become very, very active in the Communist Party locally. He hosts meetings at his house. He becomes a branch delegate to the state conference, stood for election in 1961 to the Senate as a Communist Party candidate, and he became the acting state secretary. So he's clearly on the radar screens, and here we've got some surveillance photos. They never are flattering, are they? You know, they always get you in an unflattering angle. This is Peter attending the Communist Party conference in 1964. His wife, Beres, also attracts attention because she joins the Union of Australian Women. Now, remember I mentioned Doris was one of its founders, widely regarded as being a communist front. By 1962, Peter is actually acting state secretary of the Communist Party in Tasmania. So clearly rising through the local ranks at least, but he's actually making some critics in the party locally. He's accused of developing a personality cult. Now, this context to this is a few years after Stalin's been denounced by Khrushchev, right? But anyway, believe it or not, there's a personality cult allegedly forming. But he's also deviating from the party line. So, for instance, the Soviets have tested some nuclear weapons around this time, and he actually criticises that. Now, the party line was, well, they're justified in doing it because the Americans are doing it. Peter's attitude is, I don't care who's doing it, they shouldn't be doing it. Peace is a very strong theme right through Peter's dossier. And interestingly, and this is interesting, if you have a good look at the heading of this one. So this is a report that comes out of the Communist Party of Australia closed state committee meeting. Right, so anyway, it reports what he says at the meeting. He says peace was still the #1 matter for the party. So for him, peace is the key here. You see a bit of a social movement sort of theme emerging with some of these people as well. There's an interesting copy on his file of an open petition sent to John Kennedy against US military intervention in South Vietnam, and there's Peter's signature on that. I don't know how the petition routed through ASIO first, but somehow it routed through there before it got to the Oval Office. Interestingly enough, as the Vietnam movement got underway, and I had the pleasure of meeting somebody earlier who was telling me about his early experiences in the peace movement, so this one might appeal to you. He was at a demonstration where Bishop Geoffrey Cranswick, who had been Bishop of Gippsland but became Anglican Bishop of Tasmania, they were there on the platform together, and the bishop asked him, "Are you a communist?" To which Peter answered resoundingly, "Yes." Which, interestingly, the bishop then congratulated him for standing up for his principles and his rights. Now, of course, ASIO was taking a somewhat different view of this, believing that it was all a bit of a front. Now, he becomes increasingly disillusioned with the party, partially for several reasons. One reason is the splits that start to emerge between the Soviet and the Chinese elements in the party. But you get a sense that part of it is simply going through stages of life. He talks about, I'm spending all my time in the party and it's costing my business, and my wife and my kids are suffering at the same time. So there's a bit of shift in his, commitment, shall we say. Similarly, the party side of the garden side of things is ramping up, and you start to see this sort of shift. Interestingly, Beres, they join a parents and friends and the YMCA, and she comes to the conclusion that you can find good people anywhere. They're not starting to see things in black and white terms anymore. There are suspicions about Peter in the party. There's rumours that he was a military policeman in his time with the military, and there's questions in the party as to whether he's actually like a plant within the party. And we see him by 1970 saying, I basically left. Still very active in the peace movement, but he's parted ways with the party. Now, finally, I just want to talk about the spy. So, the spy's code name in ASIO was Sylvia. Her identity has been revealed some time ago. She was a middle-aged mother of one called Kay Marshall. She comes to attention in 1963 for her involvement in what was known as the Skripal case, when a Soviet diplomat, Ivan Skripal, was unmasked as the mastermind of a spy ring, attempting to obtain classified secrets about the Woomera long-range rocket test in the US facility at Northwest Cape. She was in her mid-40s, divorced, but was described by ASIO as a woman of considerable resourcefulness, courage and charm. Now, she's not Mata Hari, by the way. How she gets mixed up in all of this is in the 1950s, she's working at the British High Commission in Wellington, of all places, in New Zealand. And Soviet diplomats were coming in, and one of them asked her out on a date. And she goes to her boss and says, what should I do? They talk to intelligence, and they're like, well, if you want to do it, you can help us here. And so she, went along with it for a period of time. And she then later moved to Australia, but clearly the Soviets thought she was sympathetic, because after she arrived in Australia, she was contacted by by somebody, not saying who he was at the time, and said, "Oh, come and meet me at Taronga Park Zoo." And she was given various instructions, including she had to be reading The Age. The Age seems to be the giveaway at these clandestine drop-offs and meeting up. Anyway, ASIO, she goes to ASIO, she tells ASIO all about it. ASIO says, yep, okay, if you want to do it, please help us. So there she is at Taronga Park Zoo with her a copy of The Age. That handbag is full of recording devices. The man that she was meeting said his name was John. He turns out to be Ivan Skripal, the first secretary of the Soviet embassy in Canberra. And he asked her to get a job at the British High Commission in Canberra. And he pays her £100 in £5 used banknotes. At one stage, he actually reached for her handbag and noticed how heavy it was and asked what was in it. And she replied, cosmetics, bottles, a cigarette case, and a little bit of money. They then arranged to meet again in Sydney, and on and off they meet at various locations in Sydney over the next few months, including restaurants, Coogee Beach, outside hospitals and things like that. Interestingly, Mr. Skripal needed permission to come up to Canberra, from Canberra, which the federal government always gave, and Mrs. Skripal always came along. Maybe not to these meetings, but she always came up with him, interestingly. Anyway, after a year, she was asked to do something besides try and get a job in an embassy. She was asked to retrieve a metal container from near the pylons of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And it's the type of container that was used by Soviet intelligence, and it would have, if it had been tampered with, it would have been evident to the Soviets. So whilst she showed it to ASIO photographed it, they knew not to open it. As she gained Skripal's confidence, she would receive letters signed by him he signed his name Teresa. And anyway, she was given a vial of chemicals, and then she'd apply the chemicals to the letters and up would pop the secret letter. And as you can see here, you've got, the invisible ink. In this message, she was asked to go to Woolloomooloo and retrieve another metal cylinder from a railing. So she goes there and she finds the metal cylinder. Again, ASIO are not going to open any of these things. The thought is this is testing her on the Soviet side. She's then asked to go to Waverley Cemetery in the eastern suburbs to collect a parcel concealed in a grave. If you were a scriptwriter, you could not come up with this stuff. Right. Now, this contained a Canadian passport and the photograph of a mystery man that they could not identify. Now, in December 1962, she was asked to take a present to Adelaide. And there's someone who's been to Adelaide this morning. Assume you weren't dropping off anything while you're in Adelaide.
I picked a couple things up, actually.
There you go. And she was asked to pass it to a man she would meet on a street corner in suburban Stepney. He was supposed to be 5'11", 45 years old with horn-rimmed glasses, and he'd be carrying a briefcase with a copy of The Age. The Age was their newspaper of choice. Now, she was given a parcel to give to him. It contained a radio transmitter. And she followed the instructions, but of course ASIO were in on it. They staked the street out. There were agents disguised as pedestrians and tradespeople, hidden cameras rolling from the back of vans and windows, just like in the movies. But the man never approaches her. So she's just filmed walking up and down, up and down. Nobody ever approaches her. She never meets Skripov again. Not long after, Sir Garfield Barwick, the Minister for External Affairs, declares Skripov persona non grata and expels him as the mastermind. So what their concern was, the Adelaide connection was the Woomera long-range weapons facility and that sort of thing. Now, Kay is shepherded out of the country when this is all happening for a little while, just in case it gets a little bit too hot for her. And by the way, Skripov had opened the embassy after Petrov had been expelled. So the Russians weren't having a great time having their embassy in Canberra at this point. Some interesting assessments of Kay from ASIO's report. Again, I mentioned the considerable charm and resourcefulness. Skripov exhibited a remarkable confidence in the agent from the very beginning, which was a tribute to her capabilities. And he never attempted to sway her ideologically, romantically, or with promises or sums of large money. He clearly believed she was a fellow traveller. There is a slightly sinister twist to this story. So a few days after Kay was in Adelaide, a man called Stanislaw Kilansky was found hanged at the Adelaide golf course. The press speculated whether he was Mr. X, you know, the photograph in the passport. Clearly not. But a few years ago, journalist James Butt was reviewing the ASIO footage of the failed letter drop, and he actually identified Kalinski in the footage. Across the road from where Kay was walking up and down the street, there was a wedding party, and Kalinski can be seen getting out of a car disguised as the wedding photographer, and he had the horn-rimmed glasses and all of that. And he looks nervously scanning the locale, and his face drops. So the supposition is he's seen one of the cameras. Presumably he told his handlers, and of course the old adage, dead spies tell no tales. And the death was made to look like suicide. So this does actually highlight the risks that Kay was running while she was working for ASIO. You might be asking, I'm going to wrap up in a moment, but what actually happened to Kay? Well, that was the end of her glamorous spy days. She, though, did record, interestingly enough, her experiences for ASIO, and it was used in a training movie, not video in those days. It was, 35 millimetres or whatever, called Legal Resident, and we have that in our collection where she was talking about some of the techniques. She then apparently lived the quiet life until her death in 1992. So just very quickly, if any of you are interested in seeing, if you haven't, what we've got in this space, our website, naa.gov.au, Record Search is our online database. You can search all of the files that people I've referred to. Their files have been digitised, so you can view those on our website. So here I've just done a search on Peter Cundall, and you can see there's all sorts of material. His ASIO file ran to 3 parts, 3 volumes, so it was quite extensive. Now, if you are wondering whether you might have an ASIO file yourself, as I said, the records are still in ASIO, so you can submit us a reference inquiry. So go back to our homepage, help with your research, ask us about the collection, and we've got a web form about intelligence and surveillance records. And if you don't have one, you'll get an answer pretty quick. I had that experience quite recently for somebody. And I'd like to particularly acknowledge Dr. Deary's family for photographs and things throughout the presentation about her grandfather and Cheryl and others on the slide. That's it. Sorry, for a little bit long, but I hope you enjoyed it.